8 in the morning, May 8, 1944, a bus carrying 18 German prisoners of war turns off Michigan State Route 17 and approaches the main gate of the Willow Run bomber plant outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. The prisoners are Afrika Korps veterans, captured in Tunisia in May of 1943, transferred to the United States in July, held at Camp Custer in central Michigan since November. They are wearing American-issued blue denim work clothes with large white block letters PW stenciled across the back. Their guards are 2 American military police corporals and a lieutenant from the office of the Provost Marshal General who speaks fluent German. The prisoners are being transported to a defense plant for a special tour that has been authorized by the War Department as part of an experimental re-education program. They have not been told what factory they are visiting. They have been told only that they will see something that German leadership has not allowed them to see, and that they should pay attention. The bus passes through the gate. The guards on duty wave them through. The bus rolls onto a service road that runs alongside a building so long that the prisoners, looking out the windows, cannot see either end of it. The building is the Willow Run Assembly Hall. It is 3/4 of a mile in length, the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. The bus stops at a personnel entrance halfway down the side of the building. The lieutenant turns in his seat and tells the prisoners in clear and unhurried German that they are about to enter the plant where the Ford Motor Company manufactures B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. He tells them that the plant produces 1 complete bomber every 63 minutes. He tells them that the plant has produced 453 bombers in the previous month. He tells them they will be inside the plant for approximately 90 minutes. He tells them not to talk to American workers, not to touch any equipment, and to keep walking in the group. Then he opens the door and walks them in. What the prisoners see when they enter the main assembly hall through the personnel doorway is a continuous moving production line of 4-engine heavy bombers in various stages of completion. The line stretches into the distance in both directions. At the far end of the building, where the prisoners cannot quite see, complete B-24 Liberators are being towed under their own power off the final assembly position and out onto the flight ramp. At the other end of the building, an aluminum subframe arrives every 63 minutes from a feeder line. Between these 2 endpoints, the bomber moves down the assembly line at a continuous rate of approximately 1 foot per minute, picking up subassemblies and components and systems as it goes. At one point in the line, a complete tail section is mated to the fuselage. At another point, the wings are attached. At another point, 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp radial engines are bolted to the wings, each engine arriving on its own dedicated overhead conveyor from the engine receiving dock. At another point, the landing gear is installed. At another point, the bomb bay doors. At another point, the gun turrets. At another point, the radio equipment. At another point, the rubber fuel tanks. At another point, the entire instrument panel for the cockpit is fitted in a single drop-in unit that has been pre-assembled on a separate line. The prisoners walk past all of this. They have been told to pay attention. They are paying attention. They are also, almost involuntarily, counting. They are counting the number of aircraft they can see in various stages of completion. The number is 42. 42 B-24 Liberators are physically inside the building at this moment, each one moving forward at approximately 1 foot per minute, each one approaching completion. The lieutenant walks the group along the floor for 90 minutes. They see riveters, welders, machinists, hydraulic press operators, parts feeders, quality inspectors, supervisors, and crane operators. At no point do they see chaos or shortages or improvisation. The plant runs the way a Swiss watch runs, except a Swiss watch does not produce 4-engine bombers, and a Swiss watch is not 3/4 of a mile long. What broke in those Afrika Korps veterans in the 90 minutes they walked through the Willow Run Assembly Hall in May of 1944 was the structural assumption around which their entire worldview had been organized for the previous decade. Nazi propaganda had told them since the rise of the regime in 1933 that Germany was the most industrially capable nation on Earth, that German engineering was unmatched, that German factories produced more, faster, better than any competitor. They had grown up hearing this. They had been told it again in school, in the Hitler Youth, in their initial military training, in the Africa Corps unit briefings before they shipped out to North Africa. They had believed it in the way that people believe things they have heard repeatedly from sources they trust. They had been captured in Tunisia in May of 1943 and brought to the United States in conditions that were dignified, well-fed, and orderly. They had drawn certain conclusions from that. They had attributed it to American wealth, to American naivete, to American softness. They had not attributed it to American industrial competence, because their entire ideological formation had instructed them that American industrial competence could not exist on a scale that threatened Germany. The 90 minutes inside Willow Run dissolved that assumption completely. What they saw was not an exaggeration of German factory production. What they saw was not propaganda. What they saw was an order of magnitude greater scale, more efficiency, more discipline, and more sustained throughput than anything they had ever seen at any Daimler-Benz factory or Henschel Works or Maybach plant. They saw, in those 90 minutes, the visible operational refutation of the central economic claim of National Socialism. The men leaving the building that morning, climbing back onto the bus, looking at each other in silence, understood something that they would never quite be able to communicate to anyone who had not been there. The war was over. Not the war they were going to read about in the newspapers next month. The war had already been over for many months. They had not known it yet. They knew it now. The popular history of the Second World War spends almost no time on the German prisoners of war who were held in the United States, and even less time on what those prisoners saw and concluded during their captivity. The popular history focuses on the battlefronts. It focuses on the famous battles. It focuses on the generals and the soldiers and the equipment. The German POW experience in America, which involved over 425,000 individuals held in 511 camps across 45 states between 1942 and 1946, is a footnote in most accounts of the war. But this experience, which exposed nearly 500,000 Wehrmacht veterans to the American industrial economy at point-blank range, was one of the most consequential single elements of the post-war transformation of Germany. The men who returned home from American POW camps in 1945 and 1946 had seen something. What they had seen would shape the next 40 years of German political and economic life. It would inform the Wirtschaftswunder, the post-war economic miracle. It would inform the German embrace of liberal democracy. It would inform, eventually, the European integration project. But it began with bus tours of factories like Willow Run, where Wehrmacht veterans walked through American production lines and slowly understood what they were looking at. The men who organized these tours, the Office of the Provost Marshal General and the War Department's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, were not famous. The program itself was not famous. The American public throughout the war was not allowed to know that German POWs were being given factory tours. It was a classified element of an even more classified program called the Idea Factory, run by General Stephen S. Davison and Captain Walter H. Schoenstedt and the soon-to-be General S. L. Marshall, that aimed to inoculate certain selected German prisoners against Nazi ideology through systematic exposure to the realities of American industry, democracy, and society. The program ran from 1943 through 1946. It processed approximately 25,000 prisoners through various levels of exposure. The tour of Willow Run was one of its most powerful instruments. The German prisoners of war held in the United States during the Second World War were almost all captured between November of 1942 and the spring of 1945. The first major group came from the surrender of the Africa Corps in Tunisia in May of 1943, when approximately 275,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner over the course of 3 weeks. The British took the bulk of them, but the Americans took roughly half. Within weeks, the American captives were being shipped across the Atlantic on returning empty troop transports, the same ships that had delivered American soldiers to North Africa, now carrying German soldiers back the other way. By July of 1943, the American POW system was struggling to accommodate the influx. New camps were being built in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and dozens of other states. The pace of construction was extraordinary. A camp that did not exist in May of 1943 might be operational, housing 2,000 prisoners by September. The basic arrangement was set by the 1929 Geneva Conventions, to which the United States and Germany were both signatories. POWs were to be housed in conditions equivalent to those of American military personnel in similar locations. They were to receive medical care, religious services, recreational facilities, and the right to organize among themselves. They were to be allowed to work for wages, with the wages held in trust until repatriation. The American government adhered to these standards more scrupulously than any other major belligerent. American POW camps were not luxurious, but they were clean, adequately heated, well-fed, and run according to published regulations that prisoners could appeal to when they believed they were being mistreated. By comparison with German prison camps for American and British soldiers, the American camps were palaces. By comparison with German prison camps for Soviet soldiers, where over 3 million Red Army prisoners died of starvation, exposure, and deliberate killing, the American camps were on a different planet entirely. Meanwhile, in Berlin, German military intelligence had been struggling for over a year to make sense of what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. In March of 1943, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, was looking at a series of reports from agents in Sweden, Portugal, Switzerland, and the United States itself, all of which described American industrial production at scales that did not match any model the Abwehr could construct. The reports described Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The reports described Boeing's plant in Wichita producing one B-29 Super Fortress every 15 hours. The reports described shipyards in Maine, in Mississippi, and in California producing entire Liberty cargo ships in less than 10 days from keel laying to launch. The reports described American aluminum production at levels that exceeded all of German production combined. They described American copper production, American steel production, American aviation fuel production, American truck production, American tank production. Every category, when measured, showed the United States producing at scales 5 to 20 times greater than Germany was producing. Canaris had his analysts check the reports 3 times. The reports kept coming back unchanged. The volume of intelligence sources was so large and so geographically dispersed that it could not be the result of American disinformation. The Americans were genuinely doing what the reports said they were doing. Canaris took the assembled intelligence to senior Wehrmacht leadership. The reaction in the spring of 1943 was almost universal disbelief. Senior generals dismissed the reports as American propaganda. Senior Nazi Party officials accused the Abwehr of defeatism. Some suggested that the photographs accompanying the reports were models or staged sets or doctored images. The numbers could not be true. If they were true, Germany was facing destruction. Therefore, in the political logic of the Reich in 1943, the numbers must not be true. There was one senior figure in the German government who did not dismiss the reports. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, took them entirely seriously. Speer had been an architect before he was a minister, and he had a practical understanding of how factories actually worked. He looked at the intelligence on American aluminum consumption, calculated backwards from the reported aircraft production figures, and concluded that the Americans were almost certainly producing approximately what the reports said they were producing. He looked at American steel production, calculated the implied tank production, and arrived at numbers that explained why the Wehrmacht was being progressively outnumbered on every front. He looked at American shipbuilding, calculated the implied Atlantic supply tonnage, and concluded that the Battle of the Atlantic was already lost in industrial terms, regardless of how many U-boats the Kriegsmarine could keep operating. Speer kept these conclusions to himself. He wrote them in private notes. He did not raise them in his meetings with Hitler because raising them would have been politically catastrophic. The German leadership in 1943 was committed to the proposition that the Allies were exaggerating their capabilities and that Germany could still win through military operations. Anyone who challenged that proposition was risking accusation of defeatism, which under the regime's wartime legal regime could mean execution. Speer was a high-ranking minister with personal protection from Hitler, but even he understood that there were limits to how directly he could state what the intelligence showed. So he kept quiet, did his job as best he could, and watched, in private despair, as his country slowly grasped the dimensions of what was happening in American factories an ocean away. The numbers the reports gave Canaris were, if anything, conservative. In April of 1944, Willow Run produced 453 complete B-24 Liberator bombers in 468 working hours. That was a production rate of one finished bomber every 63 minutes, achieved on a sustained basis across 2 9-hour shifts working 6 days a week. The plant employed approximately 42,000 workers at peak. The total floor area was 3.5 million square feet. The main assembly hall was 3/4 of a mile long. The plant had been built from open Michigan farmland in 22 months between April 1941 and February 1943. It had been designed by Charles Sorensen of Ford Motor Company, a Danish-born production engineer who had been hired by Henry Ford in 1905, and had spent 40 years figuring out how to make automobiles, trucks, and tractors faster than any competitor on Earth. When Edsel Ford, Henry's son and president of Ford Motor Company, had visited a consolidated aircraft B-24 production facility in San Diego in early 1941 and watched workers hand-fitting each individual aircraft component, Sorensen had told him that they could build B-24s the same way Ford built cars. Sorensen claimed in a famous boast in 1941 that he could produce one bomber an hour. 3 years later, in April of 1944, that boast had been met. The aircraft coming off the Willow Run line in 1944 was a 4-engine heavy bomber with over 1,300,000 individual parts, 320,000 rivets, and structural tolerances that had to be held to 2/10,000ths of an inch. The consolidated factory in San Diego, working in the pre-war craftsman manner, had taken approximately 200,000 man-hours to build each B-24. Willow Run, by 1944, was building each B-24 in approximately 18,000 man-hours, a reduction in labor per aircraft of about 11 to 1. The same airplane, 11 times less labor. That difference, that reduction in labor per aircraft, was what American mass production actually meant. It was what the Afrika Korps prisoners in May of 1944 were walking through. The workforce inside Willow Run in the spring of 1944 was not what the prisoners had been led to expect from German propaganda about America. Approximately 35% of the workers were women. About 12% were black, working alongside white workers on integrated production lines despite the broader segregation of American society at the time. About 8% were workers with physical disabilities who had been excluded from military service but who could perform precision assembly work seated at benches. About 4% were workers over 65 years old. The plant operated continuously around the clock with 3 8-hour shifts. The cafeterias served 3 meals a day to workers regardless of shift. The medical facilities were staffed by company doctors and nurses around the clock. The transportation system, an extension of Detroit's Department of Street Railways, ran buses to and from the plant on 20-minute headways 24 hours a day, delivering workers from across southeastern Michigan and returning them home. The Wehrmacht prisoners, walking through the plant, looked at this workforce and tried to make sense of it. The Reich's ideological framework had explicitly rejected the labor models the prisoners were now seeing. Women in industrial employment, by Nazi doctrine, were a temporary wartime expedient that would end with peace. Black workers in skilled positions were impossible in the racial worldview the prisoners had been trained to accept. Disabled workers were classed by the Reich as economic burdens, in some cases targeted for elimination through the T4 euthanasia program. Yet here, in this Michigan factory, all of these workers were performing skilled industrial labor at productivity rates the Reich could not match. The prisoners did not have to understand the ideology to feel the implications. They could see that the American system, whatever else one thought of it, was producing more bombers, more efficiently, with a more diverse and inclusive workforce than anything the Germans had organized in their own factories. The conclusion drew itself. The Willow Run plant had been designed by a team led by Albert Kahn, a Detroit-based industrial architect who had built more than 1,000 factories during his career. Kahn, born in Raunen in Rhineland-Palatinate, had emigrated to the United States with his family in 1880, settled in Detroit, and trained as an architect. Through the early 20th century, he had developed a particular specialty in designing single-story industrial buildings with extensive natural lighting, reinforced concrete construction, and column spacing optimized for moving assembly lines. He had built Ford's Highland Park plant in 1909, which was the original birthplace of modern mass production. He had built Ford's River Rouge complex in the 1920s, which, at the time of its completion, was the largest integrated industrial facility in the world. He had built dozens of Soviet factories in the 1930s under contracts with the Stalin regime, transferring American mass production techniques to the Soviet Union in a series of installations that would later prove crucial to Soviet armaments production during the same war. When the Willow Run contract came to Kahn in 1941, he was 62 years old and in poor health. He took the contract anyway. He designed the building in 9 weeks. The basic concept was simple. The assembly line would be a single, long, straight progression from one end of the building to the other, with sub-assemblies feeding in from perpendicular branches. The roof would be supported by tall steel columns spaced 60 feet apart, giving the assembly floor maximum open area for moving aircraft. The lighting would be a combination of overhead fluorescents and large monitor windows in the roof that would provide natural daylight on bright days. The HVAC system would be sized for the peak heat load of a Michigan summer. The plant came in under budget. It was completed faster than any comparable construction project in American history. Kahn died in December 1942, 2 months before the first complete B-24 was rolled off the Willow Run line. He had built the building that built the bombers that built the air war. Willow Run was the most famous American war plant, but it was not the only one. The German prisoners who toured American factories during the re-education program saw, in many cases, several different plants in different industries. They saw the Detroit Tank Arsenal, where Chrysler produced M4 Sherman tanks at the rate of approximately 10 per day across most of 1943 and 1944. They saw the Boeing factory in Wichita, where B-29 Superfortress bombers were emerging from a similarly accelerated production line. They saw the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, where Liberty cargo ships were being launched in less than 2 weeks each. They saw the General Motors Allison plant in Indianapolis, the Wright Aeronautical plant in Patterson, the Curtiss-Wright facility in Buffalo. Each of these facilities was producing some critical category of war material at scales that exceeded anything the Germans could match in their corresponding categories. The cumulative effect of these tours, multiplied across thousands of prisoners over 3 years, was substantial. Prisoners who had been selected for the re-education program because they showed early signs of skepticism toward Nazi ideology returned to their camps after their tours with stories that they shared, cautiously, with other prisoners. The stories spread. By 1945, the existence of the factory tours and the rough nature of what the tour participants had seen was common knowledge across the American POW camp network. Prisoners who had not personally been on a tour still knew through second-hand accounts and rumor that the American industrial economy was operating at scales the Reich could not match. The information could not be suppressed because the prisoners were the ones bringing it back to camp. The information could only be denied, and as time went on, fewer and fewer prisoners were willing to deny what they had heard from comrades they trusted. Most German prisoners in the United States never toured Willow Run or any equivalent factory. They worked instead on American farms. The labor shortage caused by American military mobilization had emptied agricultural communities across the country of able-bodied men. The remaining farmers, particularly in the Midwest, were facing harvests they could not bring in. The War Manpower Commission, working with the Office of the Provost Marshal General, organized the contract employment of German POWs as agricultural labor. By 1944, over 175,000 German prisoners were working on American farms or in food processing plants. The largest single POW agricultural camp was at Algona in northern Iowa, which housed over 10,000 prisoners across its main facility and 34 subsidiary branch camps. The work was hard. The prisoners harvested corn, soybeans, sugar beets, potatoes, and dozens of other crops. They worked in canning factories processing those crops into the K rations and C rations that the American Army was simultaneously shipping to the European theater to feed the soldiers fighting against the Wehrmacht. The prisoners understood the irony. They were producing food that would be eaten by the men who were killing their former comrades. They were also, in many cases, producing more food per day than they had ever seen produced in equivalent German operations. The Iowa cornfields, with their flat, unbroken expanses extending to the horizon, the mechanical harvesters that could process acres per hour, the grain elevators capable of storing tens of thousands of bushels, the rail cars hauling the harvested grain to feedlots and processing plants, all of this was a visible demonstration of an agricultural system at scales that German farming had never approached. The prisoners worked the system. The system worked. The POW camp food itself was a daily lesson. Under the Geneva Convention, the prisoners had to be fed at the same standards as American military personnel in equivalent stationary positions. American military food, by the standards of any other army in the world in 1944, was extraordinary. The prisoners received fresh meat at least once a day. They received eggs at breakfast. They received butter, milk, white bread, fresh vegetables, fruits, coffee, sugar, salt. They received quantities of food that German civilians at home had not seen since 1939. They received quantities of food that frontline German soldiers had not seen since 1942. The American POW administration found in its surveys of prisoners that the food alone was undermining German morale in the camps. Prisoners would write letters home, censored but still informative, describing the meals they were eating. The letters reached families in Germany that were rationing every potato and every gram of margarine. The contrast was, to the German civilians reading these letters, almost impossible to absorb. They did not believe their relatives were really eating this way. The American prisoner administration knew this and made small adjustments to ensure that the letters would not be confiscated by German postal authorities as obvious enemy propaganda. The letters got through. The German civilian population read them. The information about American agricultural abundance, propagated through hundreds of thousands of individual letters home over 3 years, slowly settled into the German civilian understanding of what the war actually was about. It was about a country that could feed prisoners better than it could feed itself. The official American re-education program, formally known as the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division and informally as the Idea Factory, was the institutional framework that took selected German prisoners on tours like the one to Willow Run.
Established in mid-1943 under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison and Captain Walter Schoenstedt, both former American intelligence officers fluent in German, the program operated out of a special facility at Fort Philip Kearny near Rhode Island. Prisoners selected for the program were screened by interrogation and psychological evaluation. Those who showed early indications of anti-Nazi sentiment or simply intellectual openness were transferred to special camps where the re-education curriculum was administered. The curriculum included English language instruction, courses on American history and political institutions, German language newspapers produced by the American Army that presented information the German prisoners had never been allowed to see, classes on democratic theory, religious instruction by anti-Nazi German clergy, and the factory tour program. Approximately 25,000 German prisoners passed through some level of the re-education system between 1944 and 1946. They were known internally as Special Projects participants. They went home to Germany in 1946 and 1947, carrying a body of information and experience that would shape their lives and their country's reconstruction. They would become teachers, factory managers, civil servants, journalists, and politicians in the post-war Federal Republic. The American investment in their re-education paid out for decades.
Some German prisoners did not want to go home in 1946. They had spent 3 years in American camps. They had toured American factories. They had worked on American farms. They had eaten American food, learned passable English, made friends with American civilian families in the rural communities where they had labored. They had concluded that the country they were going home to was destroyed, divided, occupied, and poor, while the country they had been imprisoned in was rich, peaceful, undamaged, and free. They wanted to stay. The American POW administration did not, in 1946, allow them to stay. The repatriation process under the Geneva Convention required all prisoners to be returned to their home country at the end of the conflict. Most of the prisoners who wanted to stay were repatriated against their wishes, but many of them, after returning to Germany, applied to immigrate back to the United States. Some used the network of American civilian sponsors they had developed during their POW labor work, particularly in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. Local farm families wrote letters of support to the State Department. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a steady stream of former German POWs were returning to the United States as legal immigrants, settling in the same rural communities where they had previously been held captive, and becoming American citizens. The exact number is uncertain but is estimated at around 5,000 individuals. They became, in the strangest possible sense, the human dividend of the American POW program. Men who had been Wehrmacht soldiers in 1942 became American voters by 1955.
The intelligence flow through the prisoner letter system was bidirectional. Just as the prisoners' descriptions of life in America reached their German families, the families' descriptions of life in Germany reached the prisoners. The prisoners learned through these letters what was happening at home as the war turned against the Reich. They learned about the bombing campaign. They learned about the food shortages. They learned about the conscription of older men and younger boys into the Volkssturm in 1944 and 1945. They learned about the deaths of brothers, fathers, sons, cousins on every front. The information accumulated. The prisoners compared it against what they saw in the American factories and on the American farms and in the American towns. The contrast resolved itself into a single conclusion. Germany was being destroyed. America was getting stronger by the month. The war could not be won. By the spring of 1945, this conclusion was nearly universal in the American POW camp network. The prisoners who had been the most ideologically committed Nazis at the time of their capture in 1943 had, by 1945, mostly become silent. The hardcore Nazis were segregated into special camps where the American authorities could limit their influence on the broader prisoner population. The rest of the prisoners, the majority, had quietly arrived at the same understanding that Albert Speer had arrived at privately 2 years earlier. The war was over. The only question was when the news would catch up to the leadership.
On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the German prisoners in American camps received the news of Germany's unconditional surrender through the camp administration. Reaction varied. In the segregated Nazi loyalist camps, the news was met with sullen silence and some isolated incidents of suicide or violent confrontation between hardcore prisoners and those who expressed relief. In the general population camps, the news was met with a curious mixture of grief, relief, and resignation. Many prisoners, when interviewed by camp administrators that day or the following week, said variations of the same thing. They were sad for what had happened to Germany. They were not surprised by the surrender. They had known the war was lost since the previous summer. Some said they had known it since they first arrived in America. The re-education program officers asked specifically about Willow Run in interviews with prisoners who had been on the factory tours. The responses were striking. Almost every prisoner who had been to Willow Run identified the tour as the moment when their belief in German victory had ended. Some said the moment had been immediate. Some said it had taken weeks to fully process. Some said they had at first denied what they had seen, and then, after talking with other prisoners who had also been on tours, accepted it. But the pattern was consistent. The factory tour was the structural breaking point of their previous belief system. After Willow Run, no rational German soldier could continue to believe that Germany would win.
The repatriation of German POWs from American camps began in earnest in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Most prisoners were home by the spring of 1947. They returned to a country in ruins. The German economy had collapsed. Cities lay in rubble. Allied occupation forces administered 4 separate zones. Food shortages persisted into 1948. Inflation had destroyed savings. The factories that had built the Reich's war machine were either destroyed or dismantled for reparations. The men returning from America stepped into this devastated landscape, carrying with them a particular kind of knowledge that no Germans who had stayed at home through the war could possibly have. They knew what a real industrial economy could look like. They knew what democratic political institutions actually functioned like in practice. They knew that an integrated workforce could accomplish. They knew that the central economic claims of the Nazi regime had been not just wrong, but inverted, and that the country which had been described to them as decadent and inferior had, in fact, been operating at industrial scales an order of magnitude beyond what Germany had ever achieved. This knowledge, distributed across roughly 400,000 returning POWs, became one of the foundational psychological elements of post-war German reconstruction. The Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, was not solely the work of these men, but they were everywhere in it. They became foremen in the rebuilt Volkswagen plant at Wolfsburg. They became managers in the rebuilt Siemens electrical works. They became civil servants in the new Bundeswirtschaftsministerium. They became, in many small individual ways, the people who knew from direct experience that a different kind of industrial economy was not only possible, but had already been demonstrated to work.
The strategic lesson of the German POW experience in American factories is one that post-war military historians have not adequately drawn out. It is that wars between industrial powers are not won solely on the battlefield, or even solely in the factories. They are won in the moments when the losing side's population finally understands, in a way they cannot deny, what the winning side has been able to do. The German prisoners who walked through Willow Run in 1944 did not surrender the war. The war had been militarily lost long before they took the tour, but they were, in their persons, the human channel through which the realization of American industrial capacity flowed back to Germany. They went home and told their families what they had seen. The families told their neighbors. The neighbors told their other neighbors. By 1947, a significant fraction of the West German adult population had heard, at some level of remove, the eyewitness testimony of returning POWs about what American factories actually looked like.
The mythology of National Socialism, the central claim that Germany was the most industrially capable society on earth, had been definitively refuted by the most reliable possible witnesses, the German soldiers who had personally seen the refutation in operation. That refutation made German democratic and economic reconstruction politically possible in a way that would have been much more difficult without it. A defeated population that still believed in its previous regime's economic claims would have been a much harder population to reconstruct. The American policy decision to expose German prisoners to American industrial reality, taken in 1943 by a small group of intelligence officers operating in a classified program, may have been one of the highest leverage policy choices of the entire war. Willow Run continued to produce B-24 Liberators until June of 1945, when the European War ended and the production contract was terminated. By that point, Ford had built 8,685 complete B-24s, plus knockdown kits for thousands more that were assembled at Douglas and Consolidated plants. The Willow Run building, after the contract ended, was emptied of its B-24 production equipment over the following 2 years. The plant was sold to the Kaiser Frazer Corporation in 1947 for automobile production. Kaiser Frazer used the building until 1953. General Motors then took over the building and used it as a powertrain plant until 2010. The building was demolished in 2014, except for one small section that was preserved as part of the Yankee Air Museum. The Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines that the German prisoners had seen being installed in B-24s on the assembly line are now museum pieces scattered across aviation collections around the world. The German prisoners who had toured the plant in 1944 went home, lived their lives, and mostly died before 2014. Very few of them, if any, returned to Willow Run after the war to look at what they had once seen. There are no commemorative plaques in the surviving museum section that mark the role the building played in convincing German prisoners of war that their country had lost the war they had been fighting for. The building's role in winning the air war is acknowledged, the building's role in winning the peace by being the visible refutation that broke the prisoners' faith in their cause is not acknowledged, but the role was real. The prisoners who walked through that building in the spring of 1944 took something away with them that nothing else in their captivity could have given them. They took the knowledge that they could not win.
In a war decided by what was built was the assembly line that produced one bomber every 63 minutes. The American war planners did not know in 1942 or 1943 that the most effective way to demolish the mythology of National Socialism would be to bring German prisoners of war to a Michigan factory and walk them through it for 90 minutes. They figured this out by accident, as they figured out so many other things. They organized the program, they classified the program, they ran the program. They took the prisoners through Willow Run, through the Detroit tank arsenal, through the shipyards at Richmond and Mobile and Beaumont, through the engine plants at Hartford and Patterson and Indianapolis. They did not give speeches, they did not lecture about democracy. They simply showed the prisoners the inside of the buildings and let the prisoners draw their own conclusions. The prisoners drew them. Almost every prisoner who walked through Willow Run identified that 90 minutes as the moment when the war ended for them. Not the moment when their physical war ended, which had already happened with their capture months or years earlier. The moment when their ideological war ended. The moment when they stopped believing that the country they had been fighting against could be defeated by the country they had been fighting for. The factory was the argument. The factory was the proof. The factory was the answer to every claim the Reich had made about its own industrial supremacy. The argument did not have to be spoken. The factory spoke for itself. In a war fought between industries, the losing industry was the one whose own soldiers, when they finally saw the winning industry, understood that the war was over. The German prisoners understood.
They went home and told their families. The families told their neighbors. The Reich's mythology dissolved across a generation of returning prisoners distributing the truth of what they had seen. The factories themselves were eventually torn down, repurposed, forgotten. But the witness that the prisoners bore did not get torn down. It lived in the testimony of 500,000 men over the next 40 years. It shaped the country they returned to. In a war decided by what worked was the building 3/4 of a mile long, a complete bomber every 63 minutes, 42,000 workers including women and black workers and the elderly and the disabled, an assembly line that produced more aircraft in a month than Germany produced in a year. The prisoners walked through it, they saw it, they could not pretend they had not seen it, and once they had seen it, they could not believe in victory anymore. That was, in the end, the whole point. That was, in the end, what the idea factory was for. The factory showed them the answer. The answer was no.